baby! Welcome back to Dwarf Fortress. Things are going pretty well. I think we might have to chop down more trees. Oh!
Hello again from Zokunushrir, Sieged Quakes, my busy dwarven colony in the north of Lelup Chulup, the mythical domain. In our first 2 years in the fort, we already had lots of action and plenty of dead dwarves, and it seems like year 3 is proving to be no different. As soon as spring came around, a group of orcs riding beak dogs, huge, ferocious, flightless birds, showed up to attack the fort, accompanied by trolls and a few other war animals. I guess we hadn't kept off the radar quite like we'd hoped. I called all the dwarves and animals back inside, which meant, unfortunately, we wouldn't be getting a chance to harvest any spring plants like I'd wanted to. We were still weak and totally unarmored. The orcs knew this siege would completely end our fortress, so I closed up the surface level drawbridge tight and set about walling off a small area of the first cave layer for security, and I set some more cage traps up to stop creatures from wandering into the fort. Unable to get inside my hermetically sealed fortress and eat my babies, the orcs and trolls set about destroying my farm plots and attacking literally any creature in the area in a rage. Meanwhile, I put my sheep onto a diet of cave mushrooms instead of grass, and we attempted to move on with fortress life like normal. We made brilliant artifacts, chopped down mushroom trees for fuel,
The word of the day is deforestation.
and laid the plans for a new library. Yes, everything seemed to be going alright for now, despite the invaders up above, and I had a moment to reflect on one of my great ambitions for the fort.
I wish I had the pit finished, but this is going to be a multi-year project.
I was talking about a pit trap, an enormous chasm with trapdoors that I could pull at any time to send invaders plummeting to a gruesomely explosive death on a pit floor made of cobaltite, one of the densest materials in Dwarf Fortress. I had made this kind of trap before, and cleverer players have even demonstrated pits where magma is dumped in to ensure invaders meet their doom. Mine, however, was just going to be very, very deep, and it would take a long, long time to make. Summer rolled around, and the siegers finally decided to leave, convinced we weren't worth the trouble.
Oh no, they are leaving. Hey, so long, bitches. Thwarted by a simple bridge.
While this cheesy defense was enough for now, I craved blood and war. This was merely a means to an end. We wanted to exterminate the orcs.
Soon, so soon.
We finally started work making steel bars and put in orders for our very first sets of steel armor and weapons. And although it's just a small note, our previously ill-tempered mayor was replaced by our bookkeeper sometime last year. The fort's lore is already deepening. In hopes of livening up the fort a little, we accepted the residency petitions of a few bards that we allowed to visit in these early days. Some of them had interesting backstories, like this guy, a dwarf with one name who apprenticed under a goblin herbalist master in his youth. Our fortress was so interesting, we even got a visit from the lady consort of a civilization of humans and weasel people. With our brand new steel weapons and armor, the value of our fort was rising quickly. It wouldn't be long before we'd face invasion from below as well, from the eldritch monsters that sniff out successful fortresses. I was waiting to train our dwarves until they all had proper weapons, praying that we could just retreat quickly if a real threat appeared. The marble mine was growing rapidly, and I worried that I would underestimate just how much material it took to make a fortress full of highly trained military dwarves. The desperate state of local defense meant that, at the moment, I'd assembled a group of the strongest punchers in the fort to go about punching any threat to death, but this couldn't go on forever. Year 3 ended with a heap of steel, some weapons, some armor, but no coordinated military, at least not yet. But also a hint of foreboding. I was worried what the future might bring.
Really, no joke. All these new mods definitely make it harder. I'm all for it, but it means our forts are going to be eventful.
Year 4 had barely started, and the grind for steel weapons rolled on. Luckily, we weren't attacked this season, and had the pleasure of trading again with the elves, although this time we had something real to offer. Some electrum trinkets that we'd made from silver and gold. I finally assembled a real squad of military dwarves, armed with steel armor and weapons, and set them to train with their proper gear for the first time. Skill gain was slow, but already dwarves were becoming adequate fighters. So I went all in. 3 melee squads and 1 ranged. We barely had the population to keep the fort running, but I knew that a brutal training regimen was our best shot at beating the orcs. While I was diagnosing some obtuse pathing problem in Dwarf Fortress, a tiny notification popped up that meant nothing to me at the time, but everything to my dwarves. Stukos Cattenraises, or Stukos Channel Hares, an Azer bard, was visiting the fort for the first time. Azers are forged into existence, and this one happened to be our particularly legendary siege operator and comedian, having lived 266 years now, long before the start of recorded history. The dwarves were enamored with them. It took them just 2 days to apply for residency in the fort. While Stukos began making friends, I started concocting a plan to move the animals from the caverns into the fort proper. But that meant we'd have to pump, dump, or drain water into a giant chamber so that it became muddy and capable of growing plants. Since the time seemed right for public works, I set about the Sisyphean task of carving out bedrooms for dwarves by hand, saving meticulously each step of the way in case Dwarf Fortress decided to crash.
We don't have weapons for everybody, I'm realizing. Or shields. Sorry guys, we're gonna go back. We gotta go back on the steel grind, I think. This is what I like to see. Growing attached to steel spear, steel shield. Oh, it feels so good. Oh, it feels so good.
Any problems I had were suddenly gone because it was finally happening. Dwarves were becoming comfortable with their shiny new steel weapons. It wouldn't be long before they started slaying worthy foes and bestowing names upon them. The traders and outpost liaison from my civilization showed up again. And this year, I got a glimpse of what it might be like to successfully trade before it was once again ripped from my grasp.
Do you see that? They're packing up. They're leaving. God damn it. What offended them? The guy moved the bin into the area and then they left.
Luckily, we were getting pretty self-sufficient, even though we were a little underpopulated at the moment. I wanted as many veteran military dwarves coming out of this fort as possible, so we'd have to start taking in more migrant waves. The downstairs bedrooms were starting to take shape, as was fortress drama.
I expelled my really annoying fucking broker, and they immediately killed him.
At one point, I suspected a dragonborn bard living in the fort of being a necromancer, but it turns out they weren't. Nice tour of the fort, though. Year 4 came to a peaceful close. Just kidding.
The Forgotten Beast, Greyon. Oh my god, this name. Greyon Yarao Gerira. Fuck it, I'm not doing that.
An enormous Dimetrodon with a poisonous bite was attacking my fort.
He's coming across the water. Immediately. Oh, kills a couple troglodytes. Yep, yeah, he's coming to the fort. It just says it has a shell. It's like, not that scary, right?
The Dimetrodon Greyon moved in to attack the fort, but my squad of newly steel-clad dwarves were there to meet it. This forgotten beast didn't even make it to the door.
Good job, dwarves. But yeah, year 4, generally a success. We didn't really lose any dwarves to anything that dramatic, other than when we kicked him out of the fort and all the dwarves immediately turned against him and destroyed him, and then my stream went out.
Although I was enjoying streaming the fort and talking to people in chat, reality was calling. I had work, bills, and a limited capacity for social interaction that were all making it pretty hard to stream. So I stopped, and I didn't open up Dwarf Fortress for 5 months, until one weekend when I decided to open up the mod pack, fix a bunch of the bugs that I'd made, and start recording it on a second screen while I worked on some other stuff. And this was great. Well, sadly, I didn't do nearly as much witty commentary on the mic. I was no longer restrained by the fact that the game was slowing to a crawl, as dwarves migrated, built across 100 vertical Z levels, and I bred dozens of war animals. Dwarf Fortress players have always been limited by their CPU, but if I just threw time at the game and allowed it to suffer at 7 frames per second for long enough, then I could do what they couldn't. And with the power of editing on my side, I could just speed up the footage and edit out all the boring parts. And how much footage could there be? Turns out 134 hours. Just like me editing this episode, my dwarves faced their own immediate obstacle, another orc invasion. On top of that, attacks from creatures in the caves were also incessant. We were having trouble finishing some of the chambers we were forced to make by hiding out here underground. We tried our best to deal with these problems, but my still mostly untrained dwarves were slow, and kills still came with some difficulty. I decided again not to deal with the invaders this year. I know, pretty tame for the guys with the dead orcs on their flag. But I assumed they were more well-armed and well-trained than us, at least from what I'd witnessed of their gruesome murders of visitors and creatures up above. In this case, it was better to take the lesser of two evils, slowly clearing the caverns of danger and giving the dwarves safer practical training. And train we did. I added targets for my archers to shoot at, making wooden and bone bolts to keep things cheap, and started constructing another training facility right next door. Although mining new areas was going a little slower than I hoped, one benefit of breaking into the cave had been the ability to collect spider silk and weave it into thread. Finally, my tiny hospital would have a robust and basically unending supply of thread. In fact, all of our industries were getting pretty robust. Steel weapons and armor were becoming more accessible. Food and drink were basically no problem with the number of breeding animals we had, and we even had dwarves free to start writing books and engraving walls. Given all this fresh wealth, it's no surprise that another forgotten beast arrived. Another dinosaur, interestingly enough, a sauropod named Fide Cyalineal, I think, with close-set, russet-colored scales, antennae, and a poisonous bite. It appeared in the first cavern layer, wandering through the water looking for something to eat. I moved a squad of military dwarves to the caverns as it came ashore, and then I ordered them to kill. The forgotten beast moved much faster on land and sped directly toward my fort, but a dwarf named Soto Bridgejoin met them in the cave, armed with a steel axe. The fight was brief, but this time it was the dwarves with the upper hand. A steel bolt from an arriving ranger sealed the deal, but it was Soto who held the sauropod off. I figured I should give her a nickname. Noticing she was a bit of a serious dwarf, I gave her the name Sternkiller. Sternkiller's performance was a positive sign. A forgotten beast, even a relatively tame one, is a far cry from the typical cave monster. This means the dwarves really were improving. Production continued upstairs in the fort, and downstairs we had dozens of dwarves hauling wood to burn for charcoal. They spent 3 months pillaging, but eventually the orcs up above did actually leave, and we were able to come back out to gather plants again. Already this was a busy year, but I expected even more migrants to show up soon. In fact, I wanted to expand well beyond 100 dwarves if I could, so that meant the infrastructure projects needed to continue. My decision to move the animals into the fort was immediately validated, and thankfully handled quickly, and I felt my concerns about happy dwarves would be validated too. For the first time in a long time, and the first time for you, the viewer, I popped open the world map to take a look at the task ahead of me. Small camps of goblins and gnomes dot the landscape, but the orcs I was looking for were just to the north of us, clumped together in the valley between mountain ranges. On the hills and savanna to the south were Tanari, who thankfully hadn't picked a fight with us yet. To the east, the last holdouts of a civilization of elves, and a civilization of Batezu, powerful devils from the world of Dungeons & Dragons, who seem to have absorbed lots of the civilizations in the area, actually. And finally, up the swampy coastline to the northwest lies our civilization, the Twilight Arches. Unfortunately, attempting to attack all of the Orcish strongholds meant we'd have to make our way all over the continent to find a way around the mountain ranges that they lay across. 12 new migrants arrived in the summer, and I assigned them to the vacant spots of military squads literally before they walked in the door. I suddenly realized I needed to properly move the dwarves out of their dirty old dormitory and into rooms befitting this growing colony. Things certainly weren't boring, as another forgotten beast decided to reveal itself. Rhaegar Fergurm's Mavis, a name from the language of the Scions of the Saw, appeared in the second cavern layer. Like the last monster, it didn't look too threatening, sorta just like a smelly alligator really, but I knew I shouldn't be too careless. I now had more than 60 dwarves to take care of after all. I immediately moved 2 of my melee squads to the cavern in anticipation of Rhaegar's arrival. Instead of rushing out, we waited for it to arrive. There would be more safety as a group. But Rhaegar was too fast. It approached while only a dwarf and human monster slayer were around, and I worried maybe I'd underestimated things. But no, it was over just as quickly as the last, and whew, I felt like I was dodging bullets. Forgotten beasts don't always go down so easily. Some early critics noted, Dwarf Fortress is a game of intense highs between decently long periods of total mundanity, and I guess on the surface this is true. But underneath every dwarf hauling beds and cabinets to their brand new bedrooms lies a personality and a history, and the granular nature of the game allows you to investigate or modify nearly whatever you want if you choose to do so. The weight of all this detail makes every decision mean even more. Our history moves swiftly, and it's marked by many fallen dwarves, epic deeds, and languorous months of hauling rocks to the garbage dump. Sometimes you find yourself getting attached, and at times the emotions are like a roller coaster. Like when a migrant wave shows up at the exact same time your chief medical dwarf is being murdered by an ambulatory plant. But hey, I guess it's a lot less violent than most other colonial histories. This awful event reminded me to set my dwarves back to training, something they'd be doing a lot of in the near future. Winter was thankfully a little less frantic than the rest of the year. We finished up some tasks and did a couple of things that I've been putting off doing. I hadn't actually assigned bedrooms yet, but they were getting built methodically nonetheless. The year ended with an artifact, a malachite hatch cover with spikes of steel. It featured an image of another dwarf with the same first name as the dwarf who made it. This dwarf lived in a fort called Abbeypold in our civilization. The artifact was dedicated to Tosid Tomes Chanted, a now very elderly dwarf who also lived in Abbeypold but was captured only a few years ago by the very orcs who now lay siege to us, the curses of romance. Maybe this dwarf, Minkot, dreams of their retribution for their ancestor captured by orcs. One day soon, little dwarf. That's all I can say. One day, very soon.